The title of the session was What Early Stage Device Medical Firms Need to Succeed. Sort of a pretty big question. I'm a researcher. I also spend a lot of time in industry with the companies, helping them to grow and penetrate the market. And so as I thought of answering this question, I have at least two sort of introductory slides that I think we ought to consider. Whoops. Oh, I see. One is, what is success? And so as I started to think about it, success for medical device companies begins with entry. And we can talk about what are the conditions which foster entry into a market. Then, even though you enter, you're not going to succeed unless the second item on this screen is met. And you have to have an idea that addresses unmet clinical need as perceived by the clinicians. And that's where I think Ann's comments at lunch were right on. The clinician perspective here is everything, because you can develop what you consider to be the best mousetrap or the better mousetrap, but if the clinician doesn't think so, or the clinician doesn't think it's easier than what he or she is already using, you're not going to go anywhere. After you've come up with that idea has to be translated into practice, and what starts out as a physician entrepreneur with an idea rapidly develops into a triadic relationship between the clinician, an engineer who can actually operationalize this, as well as a business person who can put together some of the business packaging on this, solicit financing for this. And so it becomes actually a love triangle, in the good sense of the word, in terms of getting new products off the ground, and that triumvirate is critical. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. After that, you have to have continued financing, you have to have growth, you have to have sales, you have to have enough sales to support growing a sales force to get it out there and get your product in front of the clinicians, and then the nirvana for all these medical device companies is a successful exit, and that can either be an IPO or an acquisition. In addition, we could also look at the question of what is success for a medical device startup in terms of multiple levels of analysis, and you have to consider all of these as well. First off, there's what are the characteristics of the individual, the entrepreneur who is starting this company. Oftentimes the ideas hatch with a clinician who thinks they have a better way of solving some unmet clinical need. That clinician is not necessarily interested in starting a company, they're interested in solving a problem. And that's why they have to be joined by engineers and business people to make these things more of a reality. So they're characteristics of the individual, and in particular, what we've seen in our research, it's the network that individual get exposed to. Because what we've seen is a lot of the physician entrepreneurs in the medical device space, both in the US and in Europe, found themselves in networks of other innovators or people who had great ideas who could help them develop those ideas. And so what you want to think about in terms of the ecology of innovation in the ecology of new device company startup and success is what are going to be the networks that foster the collaboration among people who have ideas and people who can help one another with those ideas. Then a second level analysis, what are the characteristics of firms that help promote this innovation? What's the technology sector that the firm is competing in? That's very important in terms of determining whether or not this company is going to be successful or not. You look at the competitive conditions in that sector. You also look at adjacent technology sectors. One of the things we've seen is that there's more financing for medical device companies when financing in adjacent sectors dies down. So, for example, when investor interest in biotech subsides, investor interest in medical device increases, and so they're actually inversely correlated. So you have to look at the adjacent technology sectors where investors can put their capital. And finally, as Ann was talking about at lunch, the regulatory payer environment in the U.S. And the rest of the world is all important. One of the things Ann mentioned at lunch, which I'd be happy to go into in much greater detail, is the what I call the economic customer. And that is, in addition to having a product that satisfies some unmet clinical need that makes sense to clinicians, you also have to make the business case to the economic customer in the provider community. And what's happened in the US, what's happened in Europe will probably happen here. You're going to have the rise of group purchasing organizations in addition to more professionalized hospital materials management people operating under budgets, utilizing comparative effectiveness research, looking for more evidence on how efficacious and cost-effective your products are. And you now have to to do a double sell of your product, one to the clinician and then one to the economic customer inside these provider organizations. Now, we've done some past research on what drives market entry and exit from the medical device space. This was published in Health Affairs about 3 years ago. I'm not going to go through the mind-numbing regression analyses that Ann talked about at lunch. You can get this off the web, but I just summarized in one slide some of the predictors of successful exit, and that's what these small companies usually look for is being able to sell their company to a big company like Medtronic, or to be able to have an initial public offering. There's a whole set of findings in the paper which I won't go through here. Some of them have to do with the firm's characteristics, some have to do with the industry characteristics in which you're competing. But another line of research which we've done is actually going to be a new case published by Stanford's Graduate School of Business. I wrote it with a colleague in operations management at Stanford. And we've just finished a year-and-a-half study on what goes on with medical device entrepreneurs. How did they get their products off the ground? And then this case particularly looked at if we pursue this whole witch hunt in the United States on conflicts of interest and rooting out physicians who are getting paid by medical device companies for innovation or using their product, we may hurt the innovation engine in the United States. And so we wrote a case on just how big are the conflicts of interest in the medical device space, and more importantly, what does it take to get a medical device product off the ground? And what it turns out is that physicians play crucial roles in medical device startup and development across the entire life cycle of that product. That's what the case goes through. We've just outlined some of the things here, but you need to have continuing physician involvement in the company, not only in terms of coming up with the idea in the first place, but helping to refine the idea, serving on advisory boards, participating in clinical trials. And so a clinician partnership strategy always ought to be part of your strategy in terms of getting your device company off the ground. I'll end my talk with just some basic strategy and execution issues that we found impact the success of medical device companies. The number one thing is whether or not you have a product that has differentiation, or what some of the VC people call franchise value. Do you have what is in the eyes of clinicians the differentiating product? And that means not only does it solve some unmet clinical need, but it also fits into the physician's daily practice without too much disruption, and it makes sense to the physician. It may make sense to you, but if it doesn't make sense to the physician, the product's just not going to sell. And there are a whole host of other things that go into product differentiation which you need to take into account, only part of which are due to the product characteristics. A second thing is, what's the scope of the market you're going to attack? Is it going to be a broad scope, like a big mass product commodity market? Are you going to go after a niche market? I think if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, what you'll see there is most of the big pharmaceutical companies, at least in the US, are now going into the niche markets, the rare diseases, things like that, where they don't have to surmount the hurdles of the economic customer as much as they would have to do in the commodity market where you're selling to primary care physicians. A third is, what is your strategy for clinician marketing and distribution? Many medical devices rely on a clinician to administer the product at the patient's bedside or point of care, wherever that is. And so the physician is actually the fulcrum in the distribution strategy of the product and the use of the strategy. It's not a pill that the patient takes, it's a device or a piece of equipment in the hands of a clinician. So you have to think carefully through how are you dealing with the clinicians out in that marketplace. You have to understand the economic customer. I spent the last 12 years studying GPOs in the United States. It's a very contentious segment, and I'm actually surprised you're even talking about GPOs favorably here at lunch, because in the United States, the analog of your group on the medical device firm side is the MDMA, the Medical Device Manufacturing Association, and they think that GPOs are from hell. And so they just don't see the GPO's interest as an economic buyer as aligned with their interests in terms of getting new product innovation into the market. They actually see GPOs as a hindrance to getting their new products in the market, and much of the litigation that takes place in the medical device space in the United States has to do with the small manufacturers of medical products complaining that the GPOs are engaged in restraint of trade and anti-competitive practices to keep their products out of the market. Lastly, I talk about execution of manufacturing, supply chain, marketing, sales. Execution is everything. I teach the course at Wharton on strategic change and implementation, and I like to goad my strategy colleagues that strategy is generic, execution is everything. And so it's basically how you execute everything you think you're going to do, and when it all goes wrong, what do you then do to make it work? Execution is everything. And finally, capitalization. I understand from today that you don't have the same sort of VC environment to work with here, but these companies often die on the vine in the U.S. just because they don't have enough sustained capital. Anyway, I hope that helps, and I'd be happy to get involved in the discussion now.